There's something most people don't know about Might Guy, and it begins long before he ever became a shinobi himself. It begins with his father. His father was a man named Might Duy, and in the Hidden Leaf Village, Duy carried a nickname that followed him everywhere he went. They called him the Eternal Genin. Genin, of course, is the lowest rank a ninja can hold, the starting point, the bottom rung. And the word eternal attached to it was not a compliment. It meant that Duy had tried again and again to pass the exam that would promote him to the next rank, the rank of Chunin. And every single time, he failed. He never advanced. He stayed at the very beginning of the ladder for his entire career, while younger ninja climbed past him. So the whole village looked down on him. To them, he was a symbol of someone who simply wasn't good enough. A cautionary tale, almost. The man who could never move forward. But here's the part that makes the story turn, and it's the detail most people miss. Might Duy was not weak. In fact, he was extraordinarily gifted. His problem was very specific. In the world of Naruto, ninja rely on three broad categories of technique: taijutsu, which is hand-to-hand physical combat; ninjutsu, which uses chakra to create effects like fireballs or clones; and genjutsu, which manipulates the mind through illusions. And Duy could only do one of those three. He was a genuine master of taijutsu, of raw physical fighting, but he could not perform ninjutsu at all. He could not perform genjutsu at all. So the exams themselves were the problem. The tests that decided a ninja's rank were built to reward the very abilities Duy lacked, and they gave almost no credit for the one thing he was brilliant at. In a sense, he was set up to fail from the very beginning, not because he lacked skill, but because the system measured the wrong things. His talent was real. It just didn't fit the shape of the test. And this is where his son enters the picture. Because Might Guy grew up watching all of this happen. He grew up seeing his father mocked, dismissed, and called a failure by an entire village. And more than that, Guy inherited the very same limitation. He too cannot use ninjutsu. He too cannot use genjutsu. Like his father before him, Guy relies almost entirely on his fists, on taijutsu and taijutsu alone. Now you might expect a child raised in that shadow to grow up bitter or ashamed or quietly defeated. But what's really surprising comes next. Instead of resenting his father, Guy absorbed something else entirely. He watched a man the world called a failure keep training, keep smiling, keep believing that effort was worth something even when no one respected it. And that became the foundation of everything Guy would ever stand for. So Guy's entire philosophy of fighting was built around a single idea, that hard work can overcome natural talent. That a person born without gifts can still stand beside and even surpass those who were born with everything. His whole existence became a kind of argument, a living rebuttal to the belief that a shinobi needs a powerful clan or an inherited bloodline or some rare ability passed down through blood in order to matter. Guy had none of those things. He had only the willingness to work harder than everyone around him, every single day, without exception. And that contrast wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice by the man who created him. Masashi Kishimoto, the author of Naruto, filled his story with prodigies, characters who were simply born special. There's Kakashi Hatake, a genius who mastered techniques as a child that most adults never manage. There's the entire Uchiha clan, a family gifted with a rare and powerful eye technique passed down through their bloodline. Talent, in the world of Naruto, is very often something you're born with rather than something you build. So Kishimoto wanted a counterweight. He wanted at least one hero whose only real jutsu was relentless, stubborn effort. Someone who proved that the story wasn't only about the chosen and the gifted. And that's precisely why Guy was designed the way he was, as the deliberate opposite of the prodigy. Where Kakashi is cool, effortless, and naturally brilliant, Guy is loud, emotional, and almost comically hard-working.
The two of them are even written as lifelong rivals, and that rivalry is the whole point.
It's talent standing next to effort, over and over, asking the reader a quiet question. Which one actually wins in the end? So when you really look at Might Guy, you're not just looking at a strange, energetic side character in a green jumpsuit. You're looking at an idea carried across 2 generations. A father who was failed by a system that couldn't measure his worth. A son who took that same limitation and turned it into a purpose. And an author who built the whole thing on purpose, to prove that greatness doesn't always have to be inherited. Sometimes, it's simply earned. What very few people realize is that Might Duy was never meant to be a footnote in Guy's story. When Kishimoto first sketched out the world of Naruto, he was fascinated by a simple question. What happens to the ninja who has no talent at all? Not the late bloomer, not the underdog who secretly carries a hidden bloodline, but the genuine bottom of the class. And so he created Duy, a man born without a single ounce of natural ability, the kind of shinobi that the village had quietly written off before he ever had a chance to prove himself. Now, most stories would have simply let a character like that fade into the background. But Duy did something almost no one had ever managed to do through effort alone. He unlocked the secret of the 8 inner gates. Think about that for a moment. A technique so dangerous, so forbidden, that it was considered almost mythological. And the man who cracked it open wasn't a prodigy or a chosen one. He was the person everyone had dismissed. He learned it precisely because he had nothing else. It was a last resort, a desperate answer to a cruel world that kept telling him he would never be enough. And here is where the behind-the-scenes logic becomes so deliberate. Kishimoto didn't give Duy that power to make him a hero of legend in his own lifetime. He gave it to him so that he could pass it down. Duy taught the gates to his son, not as a weapon of ambition, but as a gift. A way for Guy to survive in a world that would judge him by the same harsh standard that had judged his father. So the technique itself becomes a kind of inheritance, but not the inheritance of blood or bloodline. It's the inheritance of stubborn, unbreakable effort. But the story couldn't end there, because Kishimoto had a much heavier moment planned. Duy died opening the 8th gate himself. And the circumstances matter, because he didn't do it for glory, or for a grand battle that would echo through history. He did it to save Guy and his teammates from a rogue group of ninja mercenaries. The 8th gate is the final gate, the one that guarantees the death of whoever opens it. So Duy knew with complete certainty that the moment he opened it, his life was over. And he opened it anyway. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because of what he said in that final moment. As he was dying, Duy turned to his son and told him that he had never been happier in his entire life. Not despite the fact that he was dying, but because of what he was dying for. Protecting the people he loved was, to him, the single proudest achievement of everything he had ever done. A man who had been called a failure for his entire existence found, in his last breath, the one thing that made all of it worth it. Now you would expect a moment like that to break a child. You would expect Guy to grow up terrified of the gates, haunted by the memory of watching his father destroy himself right in front of him. But here's the counterintuitive part, and it's the exact reason Kishimoto structured the scene the way he did. That death didn't traumatize Guy into fear. It did the opposite. It inspired his entire life's mission. Guy took a technique that was, by every technical definition, a forbidden suicide method, and he transformed it into a symbol of love. Every time he opens a gate, he isn't chasing death. He's honoring the reason his father chose it. So the meaning of the whole thing quietly flips. The gates stop being about power at all. They become about devotion. And that transformation only works because Duy gave them that meaning first, in his final moments. But there's one more layer that Kishimoto built into this, and it's easy to miss. Throughout the series, the phrase eternal genin is used as an insult. It's meant to describe a ninja who never advanced, who stayed stuck at the lowest rank forever, a permanent failure by the village's own ranking system. And Duy was exactly that. He never rose through the ranks. By every official measure, he was a nobody. So Kishimoto used him to make a very deliberate point. He took that insult, eternal genin, and he attached it to one of the strongest and most heroic characters in the entire franchise. Because think about what Duy actually accomplished. He unlocked a technique the geniuses couldn't. He raised a son who would become a legend, and he gave his life in an act of pure, selfless love. The label meant to mark him as a failure ended up describing a man who was, in every way that truly matters, extraordinary. And that, more than any battle, is the quiet secret at the heart of his story. The story of Kakashi Hatake begins, oddly enough, not with him at all, but with the man who spent a lifetime measuring himself against him. Because to understand one of the most curious statistics in all of shinobi history, you first have to understand a rivalry that only one person truly remembered. When they were young, Might Duy looked at Kakashi Hatake and made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He declared Kakashi his eternal rival. Not a friend, not a colleague, but a rival. Someone to be caught, matched, and one day surpassed. And from that moment on, Guy began keeping score. Not in a casual way, not a friendly tally he mentioned now and then, but an obsessive, meticulous record of every single contest between them, stretching across decades. These weren't all grand battles either. That's the part that makes the record so strange. Guy counted everything. Foot races, rock, paper, scissors, contests of who could walk on their hands the longest, who could hold their breath, who could answer a trivia question first. Any measurable moment where the two of them could be compared, Guy logged it. He treated childhood games with the same seriousness a scholar might treat a lifelong experiment. And over the years, that experiment produced a number. By the time of the Great War, Guy had a figure he could recite from memory. 50 wins, he claimed, to 49. A single victory ahead. Out of nearly 100 contests spanning their entire lives, Guy led by exactly one. And here is what's remarkable. Guy didn't treat this as a trivial thing. He treated that 1-point lead as the proudest accomplishment of his life. Not his strength, not his mastery of the 8 gates, not his reputation as one of the most physically powerful shinobi alive. A single win in a decades-long scorecard. That, to him, was the summit. Now, you might expect that a rivalry this intense, this carefully documented, would be shared equally by both men. That both of them would carry the weight of every match, every close call, every narrow defeat. But this is where the statistic turns from impressive to genuinely surprising. Because Kakashi, the effortless genius, the prodigy who graduated the academy at 5 and made Chunin at 6, barely remembered any of it. Not most of the contests, not the running total. In several moments, he couldn't even recall that the rivalry existed at all. Guy would appear, fired up, ready to settle the score on some new challenge, and Kakashi would blink and quietly ask what he was even talking about. The most carefully kept record in Guy's life was, to Kakashi, a series of half-forgotten afternoons. And yet, the most unexpected part is still to come, because that gap between them isn't a flaw in the story, it's the entire meaning of it. Think about what that difference actually represents. Guy fought for every single inch. Nothing came easily to him. He was told he had no talent for ninjutsu or genjutsu, that he was destined to be ordinary, and he answered that by grinding through relentless physical training until his body became a weapon few could match. So when Guy won a contest against Kakashi, it cost him something. It was earned through effort, through repetition, through refusing to quit. Kakashi, by contrast, coasted. Victory came to him so naturally that he didn't need to hold on to it. He could win and forget in the same breath, because winning was never the struggle for him that it was for Guy. And that's precisely why Guy's tiny lead means more than any of Kakashi's easy victories ever could. A single point won through sweat and will is heavier than 100 won through raw gift. Guy's 50-49 wasn't luck. It was the accumulated proof of a man who simply refused to be left behind. But the story has one final turn, and it's the most touching statistic of all, because it involves what Kakashi actually thought when it mattered. For all his forgetfulness, for all his casual distance, Kakashi did remember the one thing that counted. He openly admitted that Guy was his closest friend. Not just a rival, not just a familiar face, but the person he was closest to in the entire world. More than that, Guy was the shinobi whose strength Kakashi respected the most. And in one quiet, revealing admission, Kakashi confessed that Guy was the one opponent he genuinely feared in a true hand-to-hand fight.
The genius who could copy 1,000 techniques, who had faced monsters and gods,
looked at his oldest friend and said, honestly, that in a contest of pure fists, he wasn't sure he'd win. So the record that Guy kept so obsessively, that lopsided little scorecard that Kakashi could never quite remember, turns out to be true in the deepest way. Guy really was ahead. He really had earned that lead. And the one person who mattered most, the rival himself, quietly agreed. 50-49. A lifetime of effort against a lifetime of ease. And effort, in the end, came out just barely on top.
Behind the familiar appearance of Rock Lee lies a decision that runs against everything the ninja world tends to celebrate.
In a setting built around inherited power, secret bloodlines, and eyes that bend reality, you might assume the most promising student is the one born with the rarest gift. Might Guy chose the opposite. He took on Rock Lee as a personal student precisely because Lee could not use ninjutsu or genjutsu at all. Where instructors saw a dead end, a boy with no talent for the two disciplines that defined most shinobi, Guy saw something else entirely. He saw his own younger self, a child everyone had quietly written off, and he decided that this was exactly the student worth teaching. That choice sets up the strange logic that runs through their whole relationship. Because Lee could not rely on chakra techniques, everything he learned had to come from the body, from raw physical training, from taijutsu pushed further than anyone thought sensible. And so, Guy did not hand him a shortcut. He handed him the hardest possible path and told him it was enough. The lesson underneath was simple, but almost heretical for that world. Talent, the kind you are born with, was not the requirement. Effort was. That belief eventually led Guy to teach Lee the most dangerous thing he knew, the opening of the inner gates. These are limiters within the body's own chakra network, and forcing them open unlocks enormous strength for a short time. But here is the twist that reveals what kind of teacher Guy really was. He understood, better than almost anyone, that the gates could kill the person who opened them. The higher you climb through them, the closer you come to death. So instead of presenting this power as a prize, he attached a condition to it. He made Lee promise to only ever use the gates to protect people precious to him, never for personal ambition, never for glory, never simply to win. The most destructive skill in Lee's arsenal came wrapped in a moral restraint, and that restraint was the point. You can see how completely this teaching took hold just by looking at Lee. The bright green jumpsuit, the bowl-shaped haircut, the thick eyebrows, the sharp thumbs-up pose. None of that is coincidence. Every one of those details is a deliberate mirror of Guy himself. Lee did not simply learn techniques from his mentor. He absorbed the man's entire spirit, right down to the way he stood
and the way he smiled. In a story so obsessed with inherited traits passed down through blood, here was a bond passed down through choice, a student remaking himself in the image of the teacher who believed in him. But here's what almost nobody knows. This underdog dynamic was not just meaningful inside the story. It mattered a great deal to the person who created it. Masashi Kishimoto has said that Rock Lee is one of his personal favorite characters to draw, and the reason he gave is telling. So much of the series revolves around special eyes, rare clans, and powers handed down by bloodline. Lee offered him something cleaner, a pure underdog, free of any magical inheritance, whose only real weapon was work. Drawing Guy and Lee together gave Kishimoto a story he clearly enjoyed telling, one where the outcome depended not on what a character was born with, but on what he was willing to endure. And that enjoyment points to something worth sitting with. In a cast full of prodigies, the pairing that resonated most was the one with no shortcuts at all. Two characters defined entirely by discipline, by repetition, by refusing to accept the limits placed on them. It is a quietly radical idea for the genre, and it is probably why so many readers latched onto them. There is no bloodline to envy in Lee. There is only the suggestion that persistence might, in the end, be its own kind of talent. That bond became so recognizable, so beloved, that it eventually outgrew the main series. It spawned an entire spin-off comedy, Rock Lee and His Ninja Pals, built around Lee and Guy and their relentless, hard-working enthusiasm for taijutsu. The spin-off leans into the humor of two people who take training more seriously than anyone reasonably should. But underneath the jokes, it keeps the same heart. The teacher and the student, still pushing, still believing that effort counts for something. Few side characters in the whole franchise earned a project of their own centered so directly on their relationship. So the familiar image of Rock Lee, the green suit, the eager grin, the endless push-ups, hides a genuinely counterintuitive truth. He is celebrated not despite his lack of natural gifts, but because of it. Guy chose him for what he couldn't do. He taught him a deadly power and bound it to a promise of restraint. And together they became proof, inside a world of inherited miracles, that the plainest path of all, sustained effort over a lifetime, was worth building an entire story around. Which brings us back to the man who shaped all of it. If you look closely at Madara Uchiha near the end of the Fourth Great Ninja War, you find something that almost never happens to him. You find a moment of genuine surprise. And to understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand who was standing across from him. It wasn't a sage. It wasn't a reincarnated god. It was Might Duy, a man with no ninjutsu, no genjutsu, and no special bloodline to fall back on. Which makes what happened next one of the strangest, luckiest turns in the entire story. Because by that point in the war, Madara wasn't really a man anymore. He had been reincarnated, restored to the peak of his power, and then pushed even further beyond it. Ordinary attacks did nothing to him. Whole armies of shinobi threw everything they had, and he simply absorbed it, shrugged it off, or answered it with overwhelming force. On paper, there was no reason to think a taijutsu specialist could touch him at all. So when Guy stepped forward, it looked less like a challenge and more like a farewell. But Guy had one thing left: the 8 gates. These are internal limiters inside the body that cap how much of a person's own strength they can safely use. Opening them removes the brakes, releasing power the body normally hides even from itself. The catch is severe. The 8th gate, the final one, is called the Gate of Death, and it is named that for a reason. Opening it grants a burst of strength that briefly rivals a Kage, or beyond, but it kills the user. The heart is meant to stop. The body is meant to burn away. So the setup was almost cruel. To even threaten Madara, Guy would have to spend his own life to do it. And here's the detail that turns this into something more than a heroic gesture. When Guy opened that 8th gate, he became only the second person ever shown to do so in the entire series. The first was his own father, Might Duy, a man once mocked as a failure who died opening those same gates to protect his son. So the technique that gave Guy his one shot at a near god was, in a sense, an inheritance from a man the world had written off. With the 8th gate open, Guy unleashed his final attack, a kick simply called Night Guy. And this is where the physics of the moment become almost hard to describe. The strike moved with such force that it visibly bent the space around it as it traveled, warping the air itself before it ever landed. It wasn't just fast, it distorted the world on its way to the target. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. When that kick connected, Madara didn't do what Madara always does. He didn't brush it off. He didn't smile through it. He openly admitted that it hurt him, and that it had nearly killed him. Out of everything thrown at Madara across the whole war, every jutsu, every combined assault, every legendary technique, Night Guy is the one attack he acknowledged actually brought him close to death. Not a sage of the 6 paths technique, not a divine weapon. A kick from a man with no special powers at all. But of course, power like that comes with a price already written into it. Opening the 8th gate should have reduced Guy's body to ash, and it very nearly did. After that single strike, his legs were destroyed. His body was failing, and he was left as a dying husk, moments from the death the technique guarantees. He had spent everything, all at once, for one hit. There was no second attempt. There couldn't be. The technique doesn't allow one. So the tension here is real. Guy landed possibly the most dangerous blow Madara ever felt, and it still wasn't quite enough to finish him, and it cost Guy his life to try. By every rule the story had set up, that should have been the end of him. And this is where the lucky twist arrives, quiet and almost easy to miss. Guy survived, not through his own strength, and not because the gate spared him. He survived because Naruto reached him in time and used his newfound power to heal a body that was never supposed to keep beating. A man who had accepted death, who had made peace with burning away, was pulled back by a chance intervention at the last possible second. The one taijutsu master in the story who came closer than almost anyone alive to defeating Madara in single combat walked away from it, when he was never meant to walk away at all. And that's the irony worth sitting with. In a world built on inherited miracles, sacred eyes, sealed beasts, and bloodline gifts, the character with none of those things left the deepest mark on its greatest villain. Might Guy's whole life was ordinary effort, repeated past the point most people would quit. And in the end, that ordinary effort became the one thing a near god admitted he feared. Which brings us back once more to the quiet man who made it all possible. People rarely talk about Naruto Uzumaki as the reason Might Guy is still alive, but that's exactly what he is. When Guy opened the 8th gate against Madara Uchiha, he did something no living shinobi was meant to survive. The 8th gate, the gate of death, burns through the body's final limiter, the one the human system keeps locked precisely because opening it is fatal. Guy knew this. He opened it anyway, and for a few blinding moments he became the single most powerful taijutsu user in the history of the series, strong enough to genuinely wound a man who had become something close to a god. But power like that has a price, and the price was his body. By the time the technique faded, Guy was dying. His muscles were destroyed, his chakra network was collapsing, and his life was measured in seconds. He had accepted it. He'd made peace with the idea that this was where his story ended, burning out in one last act of loyalty. And here's where the connection matters. Naruto had, only moments earlier, received chakra from the sage of 6 paths himself, Hagoromo Otsutsuki, the ancestor of the entire shinobi world. That chakra tied Naruto to something far older and far larger than any village or any war, a lineage stretching back to the origin of ninjutsu itself. So, when Naruto reached Guy's dying body, he wasn't using ordinary healing. He was using power inherited from the founder of chakra, and he poured just enough of it into Guy to pull him back from a death that should have been absolute. Think about what that means. Might Guy, the man who represented pure hard work with no special bloodline and no inherited gift, was saved by the most inherited power in the entire universe. The ordinary man was kept alive by the most extraordinary chakra that exists. Therefore, his survival isn't just luck. It's a quiet meeting point between two completely opposite ideas, effort and destiny, standing in the same body. Still, even that miracle had limits. Naruto's intervention saved Guy's life, but it could not save his leg. The right leg that Guy had opened the gate through was permanently crippled, the damage too deep to fully undo. So the man who once ran hundreds of laps around the entire hidden leaf, who challenged Kakashi to foot races for decades, who defined himself through physical motion, would never move that way again. His career as the village's taijutsu master was over. Now, but what's really surprising comes next, because you would expect a story like this to end in grief. You'd expect Guy to mourn the body he lost, or resent the moment he chose to open that gate. Instead, he feels nothing of the kind. Guy has zero regret. He considers nearly dying for his friends to be the single greatest honor of his life, and he means it completely. To understand why, you have to remember where that belief came from. Guy's father, Might Duy, was known throughout the village as the Eternal Genin, a man mocked for never advancing in rank, a man with no talent for ninjutsu at all. But Duy taught his son one idea that outlasted every insult, that protecting the people you love is the truest strength a person can have, and that a life spent for others is a life well spent. So when Guy opened the 8th gate, he wasn't throwing his life away. He was proving his father right, decades after everyone else had written the old man off. Therefore, Guy's crippled leg isn't a tragedy to him. It's evidence. It's the physical proof that he lived exactly the way his father hoped he would. And that reframing is why his ending feels so different from almost everyone else's. Look at the epilogue years later. Guy uses a wheelchair now, his fighting days long behind him. But he still races Kakashi. He still insists, loudly and cheerfully, that their lifelong rivalry is far from finished, that the score is still being counted, that the next contest is always coming. He refuses to let the wheelchair end the friendly competition that has defined half his life. So the man who lost the ability to run simply changed the rules and kept racing anyway. And this is the detail that makes Guy quietly unique. In a story where so many of the strongest characters die in tragic glory, burning out young for a cause, Guy is one of the very few major shinobi who survived an entire war and settled into a peaceful old age, still smiling. He got the ending almost no one in that world gets. Not a beautiful death, but a long, ordinary, contented life. Which is a strange kind of poetry when you sit with it. The man of pure effort was saved by the power of the gods, kept his cheerfulness through permanent injury, and outlived the tragedy that should have claimed him. And none of it happens without Naruto, standing there at the worst moment, holding on to a friend the universe had already decided to let go. Curiously enough, Kisame Hoshigaki became one of the clearest measuring sticks for just how far Might Guy's philosophy of effort could actually reach. Because Kisame wasn't a background villain. He was a former member of the 7 Ninja Swordsmen of the Mist, a rogue agent of the Akatsuki, and a man whose chakra reserves were so enormous that other characters openly compared him to a tailed beast. His own comrades called him a monster, and he wore the label without complaint. So when you look at Guy's legacy, you can't skip the fact that this monster, this walking reservoir of chakra, was defeated by a man who used no ninjutsu at all. But here's the part that makes the whole rivalry so memorable, and it says everything about who Guy is. Their very first meeting doesn't begin with a dramatic standoff. It begins with a mistake. Kisame arrives in the Leaf Village alongside Itachi Uchiha, and Guy steps in to confront them. Yet when Guy looks at Kisame, he doesn't recognize him as an enemy at all. He mistakes him for someone else entirely, because Guy has genuinely forgotten what his opponents look like. This becomes a long-running joke about Guy's terrible memory. The idea that a man this disciplined in his body could be so unreliable with faces. And it lands even harder later, when it turns out Guy struggles to remember his own eternal rival, Kakashi, from time to time. So the comedy sets the stage, but the fight underneath it is where the legacy really takes shape. Because in that first encounter, Guy doesn't win with some hidden trump card. He fights Kisame off through raw taijutsu, pure physical technique, refined over years of relentless training. And that plants the seed for everything that follows. It establishes, quietly, that Guy belongs in the same conversation as elite S-rank criminals, not as a footnote, but as a genuine threat. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because their rematch during the Fourth Great Ninja War carries a surprising strategic twist that a lot of people misremember. You might assume Guy needed his ultimate technique to bring Kisame down, the legendary Eighth Gate, the gate that costs the user their life. But that's not what happened. Guy defeated Kisame without ever reaching the Eighth Gate. He opened the Seventh Gate instead, and from there, he unleashed a wave-crushing attack. First came the Morning Peacock, a barrage of punches thrown so quickly that the friction ignites the air into flame. And then, as the pressure built, he delivered the Daytime Tiger, a compressed blast of air pressure so violent it strikes with the force of a meteor. Kisame, for all his monstrous chakra, could not withstand it. So think about what that actually means for Guy's legacy. He fought one of the Akatsuki's most physically overwhelming members, twice, and won both times, without ever spending his life on the Eighth Gate. He proved that the Seventh Gate, in the hands of someone who had trained every single day, was enough to topple a man built like a living weapon. But the most telling detail isn't the technique, it's Kisame's reaction. Kisame Hoshigaki almost never respected an opponent. He was the kind of fighter who measured everyone against his own strength and usually found them lacking. And yet, after facing Guy, he personally acknowledged him as one of the strongest fighters he had ever encountered. Coming from a man who saw combat as the truest form of communication, that acknowledgement carries real weight. Kisame didn't hand out compliments, so when he gave one to Guy, it was recognition earned through nothing but effort and pain. And that, more than any single victory, is the lasting impact of the rivalry. It quietly rewrites what taijutsu is capable of in this world. In a story dominated by illusions, elemental jutsu, and legendary swords like Kisame's own chakra-devouring blade, Samehada, Guy stands as proof that a man with no ninjutsu, no special bloodline, and no shortcuts could still go toe-to-toe with a legendary sword-wielding villain and come out ahead. He wasn't gifted. He was, by his own admission, a genius of hard work. And the Kisame fights are the clearest evidence that hard work was never a lesser path. So the two of them form a strange kind of mirror. Kisame represents raw, monstrous, almost limitless natural power. Guy represents the ceiling of what discipline alone can build. And when they clash, it's discipline that holds.
That outcome ripples outward through the rest of the series, because it justifies everything Guy ever taught his students about the springtime of youth and the value of sweat over talent. By the end, Kisame's story and Guy's story are permanently linked. The monster and the hard worker, the man of endless chakra and the man of endless effort.
And it's Guy who walks away carrying the acknowledgement of an enemy who respected almost no one. That's the legacy the rivalry leaves behind, and it's one Guy earned the only way he ever knew how.
Originally, Neji Hyuga was never supposed to be the quiet triumph of Guy's team.
When you look at the roster, it almost reads like a mistake in the making. Here was the prodigy of the Hyuga clan, a boy born with the Byakugan and centuries of refined technique in his bloodline, placed on a squad led by a sensei whose entire identity was built around taijutsu, sweat, and endless physical drills. On paper, it looks like a mismatch. You'd expect the genius of the Hyuga to grow bored, to outpace his teacher, to learn almost nothing from a man obsessed with punches and kicks. And for a long time, that assumption sits there, unchallenged, like a small crack in the design that no one bothered to notice. But here's the surprising part, the detail that turns the supposed error into something iconic. Guy didn't try to out-teach Neji at his own family's art. He didn't compete with generations of gentle fist tradition. Instead, he did something quieter. He took Neji's inherited genius and paired it with the one thing the Hyuga clan couldn't hand down through blood: raw, brutal endurance. He built Neji's stamina, his conditioning, his ability to hold a technique under pressure for far longer than talent alone would allow. And that's the twist that fans love to point to, because, the way many readers see it, that hard endurance training may well have helped Neji perform the 8 trigrams palms revolving heaven, the rotating dome of chakra that became his signature. The move demands more than precision. It demands the physical reserves to spin chakra out from every point on the body at once, and to hold that defense against relentless attack. So, in that reading, the mismatch was never a mismatch at all. The taijutsu sensei gave the genius the fuel his bloodline never could. And once you see that, the whole team starts to make a different kind of sense. Kishimoto didn't assemble Team Guy by accident. He designed Neji as a deliberate foil to Rock Lee. On one side stood the born genius, gifted everything by his lineage. On the other stood the hard worker, a boy who couldn't use ninjutsu or genjutsu at all, forced to build himself from nothing but effort. Placing them on the same squad, under the same relentless sensei, turned Guy's team into a living argument. Talent versus effort, sitting across from each other every single day. So what looked like an odd pairing was actually the clearest thesis statement in the whole series, and Guy stood at the center of it, embodying the idea that effort could rise to meet genius. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because the reason this all works reaches deeper than training schedules and character design. It reaches into a name. In Japanese, Neji means screw or spiral. It's a small thing, easy to walk past, but Kishimoto loved to bury details like this across his cast. The name points directly at Neji's rotating defensive technique, the spinning shield that defined him. So the boy who would one day spin chakra into a dome was, in a sense, named for that motion before he ever performed it. What could have felt like a coincidence becomes a quiet piece of authorship, the writer leaving a fingerprint in plain sight. And once you know it, you can't unsee it. The spiral was always there, hidden in a single word. But this is where the story turns heavier, because the same design that made Neji meaningful also made his ending cut deep. During the Fourth Shinobi World War, Neji died protecting Naruto and Hinata, taking a blow meant for them. And for Guy, that loss landed harder than most. It wasn't just the death of a former student. It echoed something older, a pattern woven through Guy's entire life. Guy's whole philosophy, his devotion to protecting others no matter the cost, was shaped by the comrades he had lost and the ones he refused to lose again. So watching Neji fall in that exact way, choosing to shield others with his own body, mirrored the very belief Guy had spent his life defending. The student had become the lesson. And that's what makes the moment resonate rather than simply sadden. So step back and look at what actually happened here. The pairing that seemed like a mistake, the genius handed to a taijutsu obsessive, became one of the most quietly effective decisions in the story. Guy nurtured what the Hyuga clan couldn't. He gave a prodigy the endurance to make his bloodline whole, arguably feeding the very technique Neji is remembered for.
The odd-fitting team became a deliberate meditation on talent and effort. The strange little name became a hidden signature, and the painful death became a reflection of Guy's deepest values. None of it was an accident, yet all of it wears the shape of something that could have been. That's the strange beauty of it. What reads at first like a glitch in the roster turns out to be one of the most carefully built relationships in the series. And Guy sits at the heart of it, the sensei who took a genius and taught him how to hold the line. One often overlooked detail about Tenten is that her entire design leans on a cultural reference many Western viewers miss entirely. Her name isn't Japanese in the usual sense, and her look, the twin buns, the flowing tunic, the sashes, all of it draws directly from classical Chinese styling rather than the Japanese aesthetic that shapes most of the cast. Kishimoto built her to feel a little different from the crowd. So where the other genin wore clearly Japanese-inspired outfits, Tenten was given a silhouette that echoes traditional Chinese martial arts imagery. It's a quiet nod, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. That choice wasn't random, because her whole combat identity was meant to contrast with her teammates. Guy fought with raw fists, pure taijutsu hammered into the body through relentless training. Neji fought with the gentle fist, precise palm strikes that shut down the chakra network from the inside. Tenten was designed to complete that spread from range, raining weapons down from her scrolls. So Team Guy became something rare in the series, a squad where every member covered a different distance and a different philosophy of fighting. Raw power up close, delicate internal disruption in the middle, and a storm of steel from afar. On paper, it's one of the most balanced three-man cells Konoha ever produced. And there's a deeper layer to those weapons, because the arsenal she pulls from her scrolls isn't generic. It reads like a catalog of classical Chinese armaments, the kind you'd see in old wuxia films and traditional weapon manuals. That connects back to her whole visual theme, the Chinese styling running underneath the character like a hidden signature. Kishimoto often folded real-world influences into small details most readers would breeze past, and Tenten is one of the clearest examples of that habit. A character quietly assembled from a different cultural toolkit than the ninja around her. Her ambition fit that mold too. Tenten's dream was to become a legendary kunoichi like Tsunade, one of the Sannin, a woman who stood as an equal among the strongest shinobi of her generation. That's a heavy goal for someone so often kept in the background, but it made sense for the team she was on. Guy's entire teaching style was built on relentless encouragement, the endless drumbeat of belief that hard work could carry anyone to greatness. If any dream was perfectly matched to a sensei, it was Tenten's ambition landing in the hands of a man who never stopped telling his students they could reach the top. But here's what almost nobody knows. For all the care poured into her design, Tenten became the character Kishimoto himself admitted he neglected the most. In interviews, he confessed a real regret about her, saying she was the one he wished he'd used better, the member of the cast who never got the spotlight he felt she deserved. That's a striking admission from a creator, because it means the imbalance fans noticed on the page wasn't an accident of your imagination. The author saw it too, and he owned it. So there's an irony sitting at the center of Team Guy. This was the squad that took two so-called underdogs
and a certified prodigy, and forged them into elite fighters. Neji, the genius of the Hyuga branch family. Lee, the boy who couldn't use ninjutsu or genjutsu at all, rebuilt into a taijutsu specialist through nothing but sweat. And Tenten, the weapons master meant to be their perfect third. Yet even in a trio famous for lifting people beyond their limits, one member ended up standing in the background while the others took the memorable fights. The team that specialized in elevating underdogs left its own most balanced member underserved. That doesn't erase what she represents, though, because her presence still shaped the group's identity. A three-man cell needs contrast to function, and without a ranged specialist, Team Guy would have been a wall of close-quarters fighters with a blind spot. Tenten filled that gap by design. So even when the story pushed her aside, the structure of the team quietly depended on the role she was built to play. The idea of her mattered even in the stretches where the narrative forgot to use her. And that's what makes her hidden Chinese influence feel almost fitting in hindsight. Kishimoto gave her a look and an arsenal drawn from a whole different tradition. A subtle Easter egg tucked into a genin who never got a grand arc to show it off. The care was there in the details, in the buns and the tunic, and the scroll full of classical weapons, waiting for a spotlight that mostly never came. So Tenten ends up as one of the most quietly interesting members of the roster, a character whose depth lives in the design rather than the drama. She rounds out Team Guy the way a keystone rounds out an arch, easy to overlook, but holding a shape that wouldn't stand without her. And at the head of that team sat Guy, the sensei whose endless belief was meant to carry all three of them, even the student the story left waiting in the wings. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Metal Lee, because to understand him, you have to understand that he almost belongs to a different version of this story entirely. When Guy's team was first imagined, it was built around three young shinobi and the sensei whose belief held them together. But that belief didn't stop with them. It kept traveling forward, quietly, through the years, until it reached a boy who wasn't even a thought when Guy first opened his gates. That boy is Metal Lee, and he's the son of Rock Lee, which means Guy's legacy lives on into the next generation, carried not by Guy himself, but by the student he raised, who then raised a son of his own. Now, if you think about it, that's a strange kind of inheritance. Guy never had children in the story. His entire life was poured into his students, and above all, into Rock Lee, the boy with no talent for ninjutsu who refused to quit. So when Rock Lee grew up and had a son, that son became something like Guy's grandchild in spirit, if not in blood. And here's where it gets interesting, because you'd expect Rock Lee's child to be fearless. You'd expect a boy raised on hard work and burning youth to charge into every fight without hesitation. But that's not what happened at all. Metal Lee suffers from crippling stage fright. The moment people watch him, he freezes. His hands shake, his focus scatters, and the confidence that should be his birthright simply drains away. It's an almost cruel twist for the son of the most determined fighter in the village. But here's the part that turns the whole thing on its head. That very anxiety, the thing that seems to be his greatest weakness, becomes the doorway to his greatest strength. When Metal Lee gets nervous enough, when the pressure builds past a certain point, he slips into a kind of trance state. And in that trance, everything reverses. The fear that was holding him back suddenly stops mattering, and he becomes far stronger, far faster, far more precise than he ever is when he's calm. So the boy who can't perform under a crowd becomes dangerous precisely because the crowd overwhelms him. His weakness and his power are the same thing, wearing two different faces. And that's a beautifully unexpected idea, because it flips the usual shinobi logic completely. Most fighters have to conquer their fear to win. Metal Lee has to fall all the way into his fear before he can win. It's the opposite of what you'd assume, and it makes him one of the more unusual young characters in the next generation. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the reason Metal Lee fights at all, the reason he trains through that fear instead of hiding from it, comes straight down the family line. Rock Lee learned everything he knew from Guy. Every rule about effort beating talent, every belief that a person without gifts could still stand beside geniuses through sheer relentless work, all of it came from his sensei. And now, Rock Lee trains his own son the exact same way. The same hard work philosophy, the same refusal to let a limitation be the end of the story. So when you watch Metal Lee push through his stage fright, you're really watching Guy's teaching survive across 3 generations, passed from a sensei with no children to a student with no talent, to a boy with no confidence, each of them turning their supposed flaw into the very thing that defines them. There's even a visual thread tying it all together, and it's a small detail that's easy to miss. In Boruto, Metal Lee wears the same green jumpsuit and the same bowl cut that made his father and Guy instantly recognizable. It's essentially a visual joke, a deliberate echo that the studio kept alive on purpose. They could have given him any look they wanted. They could have modernized him, softened the jumpsuit, changed the haircut to something the new audience might find less old-fashioned. But they chose not to, because that green suit and that bowl cut are a tribute. They're a way of honoring Guy's iconic look and keeping it visible in a story set long after Guy's greatest battles were over. And that's what makes Metal Lee feel like a quiet, alternative version of the original idea. He's what Guy's philosophy looks like when it's stripped of Guy himself, when the fire is inherited rather than personally earned. He carries the same appearance, the same training, the same stubborn refusal to quit. But he arrives at all of it through a completely different struggle. Not through a body that can't use ninjutsu, but through a mind that can't stay calm when eyes are watching. The obstacle changed, yet the answer stayed exactly the same. Keep working, keep training. Turn the thing that limits you into the thing that lifts you. And in that unbroken chain, from a childless sensei to a grandson he never knew he'd have, Guy's belief simply refuses to end. There's something most people don't know about Might Duy. He existed almost entirely in the background of Naruto, mentioned in whispers before he ever appeared on the page. When Kishimoto first built Might Guy, he gave him a personality that felt almost cartoonish. The loud voice, the shining teeth, the endless push-ups. But a character like that needs a source, a reason for all that intensity. And Kishimoto held that reason back for a very long time. The answer was Duy, and the way he was introduced tells you a lot about how the story was constructed. Duy was mockingly called the Eternal Genin. In the ninja world, most talented shinobi rise quickly through the ranks, from Genin to Chunin to Jonin. But Duy never passed the Chunin exams. Not once. He tried again and again, failed every single time, and the village around him turned that failure into a nickname. You'd expect a man like that to be forgotten, a footnote, the kind of character a story leaves behind. But Kishimoto did the opposite. He took the least impressive ninja in the village and made him the emotional foundation of one of the most powerful moments in the entire series. Here's why that matters for the creation of the character. Guy's whole philosophy, that hard work can rival natural genius, needed to come from somewhere real. It couldn't just be a slogan. So Kishimoto traced it back to Duy, a father who lived that exact belief without any of the payoff. Duy had no natural talent. He had no rank. What he had was the ability to open the 8 gates, the same technique Guy would later become famous for. And that inheritance isn't a coincidence in the writing. It's the whole point. The green jumpsuit, the bowl cut, the philosophy of effort as the truest form of talent. All of it was passed from father to son, and Kishimoto designed it that way from the beginning. The 8 gates themselves are a limiter system inside the body, points that restrict the flow of chakra to keep a person from destroying themselves. Opening them removes those limits, granting enormous power at a terrible cost. The 8th and final gate, the Gate of Death, is exactly what its name promises. Anyone who opens it dies. And in the history of the series, Dewey was the first person ever shown to open it. Think about that for a moment. The eternal genin, the man who couldn't pass a single exam, achieved something no genius in the village had ever managed. Kishimoto built that reversal deliberately, the lowest-ranked ninja performing the highest, most forbidden feat. The circumstances make it heavier. Dewey opened the Gate of Death to save his sons and their friends from the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, an elite and deadly group. He was outmatched in every conventional way, but by removing every limit in his body, he became strong enough to protect the children, and in doing so, he died. His last act proved the very thing Guy would spend his life preaching, that pure, relentless hard work could stand equal to natural genius. It wasn't a lecture. It was a demonstration, paid for with his life. And that's why Guy carries his father's beliefs so openly. He wears the same jumpsuit. He speaks in the same absolutes. He calls effort the truest form of talent, not because it sounds nice, but because he watched it save his life. But what's really surprising comes next. Because Kishimoto wasn't just writing a touching backstory, he was setting up something years in advance. When Guy finally faces Madara Uchiha near the end of the war, the story reaches the moment it had been quietly preparing for since Dewey's death. Guy opens all 8 gates. He opens the Gate of Death, the same gate his father opened, knowing exactly what it means. And this is the detail that makes the writing so precise. Guy chose it. He wasn't tricked into it, and he wasn't cornered without options. He consciously decided to follow his father into the 8th gate, fully aware it was meant to be fatal. Every bit of setup, the nickname, the failures, the inheritance, the sacrifice, was built so that this single choice would land with devastating weight. That's the craft behind it. A lesser story would have made Guy's power come from talent, or from a special bloodline, or from some hidden gift. Instead, Kishimoto rooted the most explosive display of strength in the entire war in a man who failed every exam he ever took. The power didn't skip the failure. It grew out of it.
Dewey's whole life, dismissed as worthless by the people around him, became the reason his son could stand against one of the strongest characters ever written. So when you look at where Guy's belief comes from, it isn't just optimism. It's an inheritance, carefully designed, passed down through a technique that kills the one who uses it. The eternal genin turned out to be the origin of everything. And in that unbroken chain, from a devoted father to the son who carried his belief forward, Guy's belief simply refuses to end.
What very few people realize is that Chojuro, the soft-spoken swordsman who first appears at the 5 Kage summit, is quietly tied to the deepest root of Might Guy's entire story. He belonged to the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, a legendary unit from Kirigakure, and that group carries a shadow that reaches all the way back to Guy's father. Because it was an earlier generation of those very swordsmen who cornered Might Duy on the battlefield, the moment that pushed a man everyone dismissed as the eternal genin to open the 8th gate and die protecting his son. So the connection is stranger than it looks. The swordsmen were never framed as Guy's personal enemies, yet their lineage indirectly gave Guy his origin. Without that ambush in Dewey's past, there is no final stand, no gift of the gates passed from father to son, no legend of the man who could open all 8. Dewey's sacrifice is the seed of everything Guy becomes, and the swordsman, without ever meaning to, planted it. Now here is the quiet detail Kishimoto built into the design. The 7 swordsmen were created as a kind of Rogues Gallery, a rotating cast of ninja defined entirely by their weapons. Each one is remembered for the blade they carry, rather than the person holding it. Kisame had Samahata, the living sword that eats chakra. Zabuza had the enormous Kubikiri Bocho, the executioner's blade that repairs itself with the iron in a victim's blood. Raiga had the twin lightning swords. Every member is a walking argument that the tool makes the warrior. But Chojuro fits that pattern too, because he wielded Hirama Kare, one of the legendary 7 blades, a heavy sword wrapped in bandages that can store and release chakra as a solid weapon. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because Chojuro is the one member of that group whose story bends in the opposite direction. He starts as a nervous, insecure boy who barely trusts himself to speak. Yet by the end of the series, he grows into the 6th Mizukage, the leader of the entire Hidden Mist village. So the swordsman's legacy, a group born from violence and feared across the ninja world, eventually produces a gentle, thoughtful Kage. That single arc shows just how far their shadow stretches, from the men who killed Guy's father to the man who leads their nation into peace. And that contrast is the whole point. Kishimoto did not put all these weapon masters into the story by accident. He designed the 7 swordsmen to stand as the philosophical opposite of Might Duy. The swordsmen believe in the blade. They believe a legendary weapon can elevate an ordinary shinobi into something monstrous. Guy believes the exact reverse, that no tool ever forged can surpass the trained human body. So the two ideas were placed on opposite ends of the same story, quietly arguing with each other across hundreds of chapters. That is why, if you look closely, Guy never wins with a weapon. His greatest feats always come from his fists and from the gates. When he faces Madara in the war, arguably the most powerful moment any pure taijutsu user reaches in the series, he does not draw a sword. He opens the 8th gate and strikes with Night Guy, a kick so fast it bends the space around it. The most dangerous thing Guy ever becomes is his own body pushed past its limit. And that is a deliberate mirror to everything the swordsmen represent. So the theme runs cleanly through both sides. The swordsmen are defined by what they hold in their hands. Guy is defined by what he refuses to hold. One generation of those swordsmen took a weapon to Might Duy, and Duy answered not with a blade of his own, but with the gates, with his own life force turned into a final attack. Therefore, the philosophy was tested at the very beginning of the bloodline. The man of the fist met the men of the sword. And though he died, the belief he defended survived. And it survived all the way to Chojuro. Consider the quiet symmetry Kishimoto leaves in place. The same order of swordsmen that helped end Might Duy also raised the boy who would carry Hirama Kare and become Mizukage. So the weapon philosophy and the body philosophy do not simply clash and vanish. They both continue, side by side, into the next era of the ninja world. Chojuro leads with the sword. Guy's students lead with the spirit their teacher gave them. Neither idea erases the other. That is the hidden architecture underneath a character most viewers barely stop to think about.
Chojuro seems like a minor figure, a shy swordsman promoted to a background Kage. But he stands at the far end of a chain that begins with the death of Guy's father. A chain Kishimoto drew on purpose to test one simple question across the whole series. Does the weapon make the warrior, or does the warrior make the weapon? And in that unbroken argument, Guy's answer, carried through the gates and passed down through everyone he touched, simply refuses to end. The story of the Ebisu begins not with a battle, but with a comparison. Because if you line up the Jonin instructors who came of age alongside Might Duy, Ebisu stands out as the man who chose the opposite path. He belongs to the same teaching generation as Guy and Kakashi, trained in the same village,
shaped by the same era of shinobi. But where Guy built his entire identity around effort and heart, Ebisu built his around pedigree. He introduces himself, without irony, as an elite tutor for the privileged, someone reserved for the children of Konoha's most important families. And that contrast was not an accident. Kishimoto deliberately populated the Leaf Village with teachers who represented different philosophies, and Ebisu was placed there as the mirror image of Guy. One instructor shouts about the springtime of youth and pushes students past their limits through sheer emotion. The other adjusts his sunglasses, speaks in careful, measured tones, and reminds everyone that he only trains the elite. On paper, the polished specialist should be the more effective teacher. The surprising record, though, runs the other way. Because here is the statistic that quietly defines Ebisu's arc. Across the series, the loud, emotional, supposedly unrefined instructor consistently outperforms the stuffier ones. Guy's methods, which look almost embarrassing from the outside, produce results that the prestige-focused approach never quite matches. Rock Lee, a boy who could not use ninjutsu or genjutsu at all, becomes a taijutsu specialist capable of standing against genin prodigies. That is the kind of outcome the elite system was supposed to guarantee, and instead, it comes from the teacher everyone underestimated. Ebisu's own record makes the point clearer. His most famous assignment is Konohamaru Sarutobi, the grandson of the third Hokage. On paper, this is the dream posting for an elite tutor, a student from the most important bloodline in the village. But early on, Ebisu treats Konohamaru's development as a matter of technique and status rather than heart. And it is Naruto, not Ebisu, who first gets through to the boy, teaching him that a name has to be earned rather than inherited. The specialist tutor is briefly outdone by a failing student with no formal teaching credentials at all. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because for all the mockery aimed at his elite posturing, Ebisu is genuinely skilled, and his role actually rhymes with Guy's in a way the story rewards. Look closely, and the parallel is deliberate. Guy took Rock Lee, a student other instructors had written off as hopeless, and bet everything on him. Ebisu, once he matures, takes Konohamaru, a boy dismissed as nothing more than the Hokage's grandson, and commits to shaping him into a real shinobi. Both are mentors placing their faith in students the rest of the village had quietly given up on. The difference is only in style, not in the underlying wager. That is the detail Kishimoto keeps returning to. Konoha is not strong because it has one perfect teaching method. It is strong precisely because it has range. There is Kakashi, the genius who teaches through subtlety and hard lessons about teamwork. There is Ebisu, the specialist who drills fundamentals and refuses to cut corners. And there is Guy, the emotional heart of the group, who teaches through belief and relentless encouragement. The village's real weapon was never a single doctrine. It was variety, a spread of mentors so wide that almost any kind of student could find someone able to reach them. And within that spread, the records still favor passion over prestige. Ebisu's arc works because he starts as the argument against Guy and slowly becomes the proof of Guy's philosophy. The elite tutor learns over time that status does not make a shinobi. Effort does. Konohamaru does not become a leader because of his grandfather's name, and Ebisu, to his credit, eventually stops treating that name as the important part. He becomes a better teacher the moment he adopts a little of what Guy always understood instinctively. So the obscure truth buried in Ebisu's character is this: he exists to lose an argument, and to lose it in the most instructive way possible. He is the control group in Kishimoto's quiet experiment about mentorship, the polished professional set beside the loud idealist,
so the audience can watch which one actually changes lives. Time and again, the answer favors the man who shouts about youth. Not because refinement is worthless, but because refinement without belief runs out of fuel exactly when a student needs it most. That is why Ebisu matters to Guy's story, even though the two rarely share a scene. He is the measuring stick. He shows us what Guy might have become if talent and status had mattered more to him than heart. And by standing as that contrast, Ebisu makes Guy's record look even more remarkable. One instructor with no ninjutsu genius of his own, quietly outperforming the elite, and proving across the whole series that the warrior, in the end, is made by the belief someone places in them. Behind the familiar appearance of Obito Uchiha, there's a truth that quietly reshapes how we understand Guy's greatest moment. Because when people talk about the Eighth Gate, they usually frame it as a duel between two men, Guy and Madara, standing alone on a broken battlefield. But that framing misses something important. The entire situation that forced Guy into that fight, the war itself, the revival of Madara, the presence of the Ten Tails looming behind everything, none of it happened by accident. It happened because of Obito. Obito was the architect. He was the masked man who set the whole plan in motion, the one who gathered the pieces, who awakened old power, who pushed the war toward its climax. And so when Guy finally opened the last gate, he wasn't just answering Madara. He was answering the endpoint of a plan that Obito had carried for years. The Ten Tails that stood so close during that battle existed because Obito had made himself its vessel. Which means that Guy's final, fatal move was, in a very real sense, a response to Obito's design, even though the two of them never truly faced each other in that instant. Now, here's the part that flips the usual story. We tend to assume that raw taijutsu, punches and kicks and pure physical training, sits near the bottom of the power ladder in this world. Above it we place ninjutsu, then genjutsu, then the legendary eye techniques of the Uchiha, and finally, the godlike strength of a Ten Tails Jinchuriki. That's the conventional wisdom. Stronger eyes, stronger bloodline, stronger everything. But Guy's Night Guy broke that assumption in front of everyone. When he struck Madara with the Eighth Gate at full force, the damage was so severe that it didn't just stagger Madara. It sent a shock through the whole field. The power on display was enough to draw the attention of forces that were supposed to be untouchable. A man with no special eyes, no rare bloodline, produced a blow that stood level with the most feared beings in the story. And to understand why that matters so much, you have to go back to where all of this began. Obito's rise as the masked man started on the very night the Nine Tails attacked the Hidden Leaf. That single night reshaped an entire generation. It's the night that set so many rivalries and losses into motion, the same era that shaped the world Guy grew up in, racing Kakashi day after day, trying to prove that hard work could stand beside natural talent. So the war that Guy fought at the end wasn't separate from his youth. It was the continuation of the exact forces that defined it, tracing all the way back to that one catastrophic evening. But here's what almost nobody knows. Kishimoto, the author, tied these threads together on purpose, so that the climax of the war would gather every generation into a single moment. The old legends, the middle generation, the young heroes, all of them converged. And in that gathering, Guy occupied a very specific place. He became humanity's answer to Uchiha eye power. On one side stood Madara, wielding the most advanced ocular techniques ever shown, the culmination of a bloodline built for dominance. On the other side stood a man whose only tools were discipline, courage, and the willingness to burn his own life away. Two completely opposite philosophies meeting at the center of the story. So when Guy opened the last gate and charged, he wasn't only fighting for himself. He was representing everyone in that world who had no gift, no inheritance, no shortcut. And that's why the outcome carries so much weight. Guy pushed Madara to the edge. He forced the strongest Uchiha to react with genuine effort, to shield himself, to acknowledge the threat. In a battlefield full of transcendent power, it was the man with nothing extraordinary in his blood who came the closest. And that's exactly why his near death against Madara is celebrated the way it is. Think about who tried to defeat Madara across the whole series. Reincarnated Kage, entire armies, users of the most powerful eyes in existence. Almost all of them failed, and many failed without leaving a mark. But Guy, a man with no bloodline and no special eyes, came closer than nearly anyone else. He didn't win. His body was ruined, and he only survived because of intervention. Yet the impression he left was undeniable. For a few seconds, pure taijutsu, refined over a lifetime, stood at the same height as the powers that were supposed to be beyond human reach. So the counterintuitive truth is this. In a story defined by eyes, by bloodlines, by inherited strength, the moment people remember most is the one where none of that mattered. Obito built the stage. Madara stood at its summit. But it was Guy, with nothing but effort, who proved that the ceiling everyone assumed existed could be reached from below. And that quiet contradiction, hidden inside all the noise of the final war, is what makes his last stand feel less like a defeat and more like a statement. If you look closely at Might Guy, you'll notice something strange about how he began, because he wasn't designed to be a hero at all. When Masashi Kishimoto first put him on the page, Guy was meant to be a joke. The bowl cut, the impossibly thick eyebrows, the skin-tight green jumpsuit, none of it was an accident. Kishimoto was deliberately reaching back to the earnest, spirit-of-youth heroes of 1980s sports anime, the kind of characters who cried during training and shouted about the power of hard work. Guy was an affectionate parody of all that. He was supposed to make you smile, maybe roll your eyes, and then move on to the more serious ninja standing beside him. But that's where the first quiet twist begins. Because a character built as a background gag needed something to do, and Kishimoto handed him a rivalry with Kakashi. It started as pure comic relief, the eternal rival, always challenging Kakashi to another pointless contest, always keeping score, usually losing in ways that were more funny than impressive. For years, that running gag was Guy's entire function in the story. He was the punchline. He was the man who took everything too seriously in a world that never quite took him seriously back. And yet the joke had a strange side effect. The more the story leaned on that rivalry for laughs, the more time we spent with Guy, and the more we came to understand what actually sat underneath the silliness. Here was a ninja with no talent for ninjutsu and no gift for genjutsu, the two skills that define almost every powerful character in the series. Instead, he had committed his entire life to a single, narrow path: taijutsu, pure hand-to-hand combat. On paper, that made him look limited. In practice, it made him one of the most disciplined figures in the entire world. This is where most people underestimate him, and it's worth slowing down on, because the assumption feels reasonable. A pure taijutsu specialist sounds like a weak side character, someone who peaks early and gets left behind once the story gets serious. But the opposite turned out to be true. When the final war arrived and the reincarnated Madara Uchiha stepped onto the battlefield, a man so powerful that entire armies of elite ninja couldn't slow him down, it was Guy, of all people, who came closest to actually killing him in single combat. Not the prodigies, not the sages, the joke character, the man with no ninjutsu and no genjutsu, physically overwhelmed one of the strongest beings the series ever produced. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because the way he did it was never meant to be survivable. Guy's ultimate technique involves opening the 8 inner gates, a set of internal limiters the body keeps closed to protect itself. Each gate opened multiplies his strength while damaging him further. The final one, the 8th gate, is called the Gate of Death, and the name is completely literal. Opening it grants overwhelming power, but it's designed to kill whoever uses it. His skin burns a deep red from the heat inside his own body. His heart is meant to stop once the technique ends, and his final attack, called Night Guy, generates so much heat and pressure that it visibly warps the space around it. It was, in every sense, a suicide move. A single strike bought with a life. So the writers had built something powerful, and also something dangerous for themselves. They had staged the perfect heroic death, a lifetime of being underestimated, resolved in one impossible sacrifice against Madara. It should have been the end of him. But there was a problem. By this point, Guy was no longer the joke. Those years of comic relief had quietly done their work, and the audience had come to love him. The punchline character had become one of the most beloved figures in the entire series, and killing him now would cost the story more than it gained. That contradiction produced the twist that changed everything. Rather than let Guy die as planned, Naruto steps in and uses the last of Kurama's chakra to keep Guy's heart beating after the 8th gate should have stopped it. He survives, but not cleanly. The damage is permanent. Guy lives out the rest of the story in a wheelchair, unable to fight the way he once did. And in a series where nearly every hero recovers fully, where wounds tend to heal and characters bounce back, that lasting consequence stands out. Guy paid a real price, and the story let it stick, which means the running gag and the sacrifice were never separate things. The years of comedy weren't filler, they were setup. Kishimoto spent all that time making you laugh at the eternal rival precisely so that his final stand would hit harder, so the punchline could become the emotional peak of the entire war. A character created as a throwaway joke ended up carrying one of the most genuine moments in the series, and, almost by accident, the man everyone underestimated became impossible to forget. Tonight, we drifted through the world of Naruto once more, tracing its quiet secrets and hidden stories, resting at last on Might Guy, the man who dared to open the 8th gate. Thank you for wandering these tales with me. Sleep is already close now, settling softly over you. And now, let these stories carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.